Look closely at the corner of the lithograph. It is a detail most would miss, tucked away in the cross-hatching of a 19th century medical journal that should not, by all rights, exist in this archive. We are told that surgery in the mid-1800s was a butcher's game, a frantic race against shock and sepsis, conducted in blood-stained aprons. Yet, in this image, we see something else. Not the crude tools of the Victorian era, not the rusted saws of the battlefield. Something else. The instruments depicted here possess a geometric precision that defies the metallurgy of the period. They are sleek, seemingly formed from a single piece of non-reflective composite. The faces of the physicians are not strained or frantic. They are calm. They are focused. They look at the patient not as a dying soul, but as a biological machine requiring a specific, calibrated adjustment. Ask yourself why the official record insists on the narrative of the primitive. What if the history of medicine is not a steady climb from darkness into light, but a long, intentional descent from a forgotten peak? We begin here, in the dust of a basement in Prague, holding a fragment of a manual that describes neural pathways with the nomenclature of fiber optics. The anomaly is small, but it is persistent. It appears in the background of daguerreotypes from the 1850s, tucked into the shadows behind men in top hats. It manifests as strange, copper-wound cylinders, standing in the corners of hospitals that were later burned to the ground. These are the healing wards of Tartaria, a term the Academy dismissed as a cartographic error or a geopolitical ghost. But the buildings remain. They are the massive red brick monoliths with arched windows and soaring spires, structures that supposedly housed the insane or the indigent. Look at the load distribution of these edifices. Notice the iron finials crowning every roof, the intricate metal fretwork that makes the entire structure look less like a hospital and more like a circuit board. Institutional gatekeeping tells us these were merely aesthetic choices, the whims of a Gothic revival, not art, not whim. Something else. These buildings were atmospheric energy collectors, designed to bathe the inhabitants in a specific frequency of resonance. The faces in the portraits from these wards do not show the hollow eyes of the institutionalized. They show a terrifying clarity. As we move from the specific to the global, the pattern becomes undeniable. You find these same asylums in San Francisco, in Moscow, in Melbourne, and in Calcutta. They all share the same impossible architecture, the same star-fought foundations, and the same mysterious lack of construction records. Ask yourself, how did a world supposedly connected by steamships and telegraphs manage to build identical high-tech stone complexes across 5 continents simultaneously? What if the great fires of the 19th century, the ones that conveniently leveled the downtown districts of Chicago, Boston, and Seattle, were not accidents? What if they were an organized erasure of a medical infrastructure that did not rely on the chemical monopolies of the emerging elite? The erasure trope is always the same: a fire, a lost archive, a redesigned curriculum. The knowledge of the resonance-based healing was replaced by the germ theory, a model that turned the patient into a battlefield and the doctor into a mercenary. We are left with the husks of the old world, now repurposed as museums or government offices, their copper domes stripped and their internal conduits filled with concrete. The faces of the practitioners tell the most unsettling story. In the rare, uncensored photographs found in private collections, the healers of the Tartarian tradition do not wear the masks of the modern era. They wear heavy, metallic pendants. They hold glass rods. They stand beside patients who are not sedated but seem to be in a state of hyper-lucid trance. Not a surgery, not a ritual, something else. The documentation suggests they were utilizing the piezoelectric properties of the very stones they stood upon. They understood that the human body is an electrical system first and a chemical one second. By manipulating the atmospheric charge within the Starfort hospitals, they could induce rapid cellular regeneration. This is the forbidden knowledge that had to be suppressed. If the environment itself can heal you, the pharmacy becomes obsolete. If the architecture provides the cure, the institution loses its leverage. This is the root of the erasure. The face of the patient in these lost records is not one of suffering. It is a face of profound integrated power. Consider the sanatoriums of the late 1800s. We are taught they were places for fresh air and rest to combat tuberculosis. But look at the equipment. Look at the massive rotating sunrooms and the intricate brass baths. Look at the scale. These were industrial-grade reclamation centers for the human spirit. The transition from Tartarian energetic medicine to the Rockefeller-funded pharmaceutical model was not a scientific breakthrough. It was a hostile takeover. The language changed. We stopped talking about vibration and started talking about dosage. We stopped talking about alignment and started talking about intervention. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings in your city are almost always the ones that were once hospitals or asylums. Why do they feel different when you walk through their doors? Is it just the high ceilings and the marble floors? Or is it the lingering residue of a technology that understood the geometry of the soul? The evidence of this institutional erasure is written in the very soil. Excavations in the foundations of demolished 19th century clinics often reveal strange braided copper cabling that leads nowhere. It isn't for electricity, not as we know it. The gauge is wrong. The insulation is non-existent. It was for the transmission of something else. This was the etheric grid, the unseen network that powered the Tartarian civilization and its medical miracles. When the new guard took over, they didn't just change the books, they rewired the world. They cut the cables, capped the wells, and told us that the past was a dark age of filth and superstition. They gave us the light bulb to make us forget the sun. They gave us the pill to make us forget the frequency. What if the faces in these old photographs are looking back at us with pity? What if they knew that one day we would be trapped in a system that views health as a commodity rather than a birthright? In the archives of the Vatican, there are rumoured to be anatomical sketches that predate the Renaissance, yet show a microscopic understanding of the lymphatic system that we only discovered decades ago. These sketches are not signed by any known master. They are the remnants of a global standard, a unified medical science that spanned from the steppes of Eurasia to the plains of the Americas. The Tartarian label is just a placeholder for a civilization that did not see borders, only energy. The faces of the statues in these lost cities, often found buried under layers of mud flood silt, all share the same serene expression. They have the look of a people who had conquered the fear of biological decay, not immortality, not magic, something else. They had mastered the art of maintenance. The erasure of this history required the destruction of millions of books and the standardization of the university system. It required us to believe that we are fragile. What if the great resets are periodic? What if the reason we find these anomalies in the 1800s is because that was the last time the gatekeepers had to clean the slate? The pattern of the investigation leads us to a chilling realization. The history of medicine is a cycle of discovery and enforced amnesia. We are currently in a period of deep amnesia. We look at the ruins of the past, the grand domed hospitals and the intricate ironwork, and we see only pretty architecture. We are blind to the function because we have been stripped of the vocabulary to understand it. Ask yourself, if you wanted to control a population, would you not start by controlling their ability to heal themselves? Would you not hide the fact that the very earth they walk on was once a source of limitless vitality? The staccato beat of the modern clinic, the beep of the monitor, the scratch of the pen, the ticking of the clock, is a rhythm designed to keep us from hearing the silence of the old world. The Tartarian doctors understood the silence. They knew that true healing occurs in the space between thoughts, in the resonance between the body and the building. They built their hospitals on ley lines and used the star geometry to focus the telluric currents, not superstition, not folklore, something else. It was a rigorous mathematical application of planetary physics to human biology. And it worked. The strange stories told by the faces in the archives are not stories of mystery, they are stories of memory. They are trying to remind us of who we were before we were told we were nothing but a collection of chemical reactions. We end this part of the journey not with an answer, but with a lingering discomfort. If the history we are taught is a lie, then what else are we missing? If the primitive doctors of the 19th century were actually using advanced energy weapons for healing, then what is the true purpose of the technology we use today? The investigation does not stop at the clinic door. It extends into the streets, into the foundations of our cities, and into the very DNA that carries the faint, flickering echo of a more resonant past. Look again at the faces. They are not waiting for us to save them. They are waiting for us to wake up. The transition from the architectural to the anatomical requires a shift in our perception of the skin itself. If the buildings were circuits, then the body was the capacitor. In the hidden medical folios of the late 19th century, those that escaped the systematic purges of the 1910 Flexner Report, we find diagrams of the human nervous system that look less like biological drawings and more like schematic overlays for a wireless receiver. Not nerves, not sinew, something else. The Tartarian healers referred to the vitreous flow, a concept entirely absent from a modern pathology. They believed the interstitial fluid was a conductive medium that could be programmed by external frequencies. Ask yourself why the modern medical establishment is so obsessed with the isolation of the cell. What if the cell is not the unit of life, but merely a symptom of the field? By focusing us on the microscopic, the gatekeepers have blinded us to the systemic. They have cut the body into pieces so we would forget how the whole once sang in harmony with the atmosphere. Consider the role of the mercury in their practices. In the official history, mercury is the villain, the toxic poison of the charlatan. But look at the vials depicted in the Tartarian surgery kits. They are not filled with raw quicksilver. They are filled with red-tinted amalgams, substances that modern chemistry struggles to replicate. These were not ingested. They were used as external transducers, not medicine, not poison, something else. By placing these red mercury resonators on specific nodal points of the body, the practitioners could bridge the gap between the patient's biofield and the hospital's atmospheric charge. This explains the strange faces of the patients in the early photographs, the eerie, luminous quality of the skin, the eyes that seem to be reflecting a light source that isn't there. They were being charged in the most literal sense. The institutional erasure of red mercury is perhaps the most thorough in history. it has been relegated to the realm of cold, war myth, and alchemy, a double layer of disinformation designed to ensure no one ever looks for the real physics behind it. What if the great pandemics of the 1800s were actually the result of the grid being tampered with? When the new controllers began dismantling the old atmospheric energy systems, the vitreous flow of the population was disrupted. The resulting diseases were not caused by microbes, but by a sudden, violent drop in the ambient frequency. The mud flood was not just a physical event, it was a sensory one. As the silt rose to bury the ground floors of the grand hospitals, the connection to the Earth's electrical heartbeat was severed. The faces we see in the aftermath, the hollowed out, traumatized eyes of the late Victorian era, are the faces of a species that has just been unplugged. They were told it was cholera. They were told it was influenza. They were never told it was the loss of the ether. Ask yourself why every major leap in wireless technology, from the first radio towers to the current satellite arrays, is accompanied by a global health crisis. Is it a coincidence? Or is it the same old story of the grid being adjusted and the biological receivers struggling to calibrate? The technical language of the lost manuals uses the term load distribution, not for the weight of the stones, but for the management of the patient's internal pressure. They understood that the human heart is not a pump, a mechanical impossibility if one does the math on the viscosity of blood, but a vortex creator, not a motor, not a valve. Something else. In the Tartarian model, the heart was the primary resonator that synced the body to the world pulse. The star forts were designed to amplify this pulse. Look at the aerial view of any 19th century hospital. The geometry is always fractal. It mimics the structure of the lungs, the branching of the veins, the folding of the brain. This is sympathetic architecture. The building and the body were a single, integrated system of load distribution. When the gatekeepers moved us into the square, flat-roofed boxes of the 20th century, they didn't just change the style, they broke the resonance. They moved us into dead zones where the soul cannot breathe. Institutional gatekeeping relies on the timeline of progress to keep us compliant. It tells us that the further back you go, the more miserable and sick people were. But the evidence of the healed tells a different story. In the census records of the mid-1800s, before the standardization of the medical boards, we see references to centenarians that occur with a statistical frequency that should be impossible for the time. Not outliers, not errors, a pattern. There were communities where the concept of degenerative disease was virtually unknown. These were the communities that still had access to the old Tartarian wells, not water wells, but energy wells. These sites were often capped with fountains that were actually complex filters for the telluric current. Ask yourself why, in the early 20th century, the government began a massive program to fluoridate and chlorinate the water. Was it for hygiene, or was it to change the conductivity of the vitreous flow, to ensure the human receiver could no longer pick up the subtle signals of the earth? The erasure trope is most visible in the sanatorium fires. Between 1890 and 1920, hundreds of these magnificent high-tech healing centers were burned to the ground. In every case, the official cause was a tipped lantern or faulty fairing. But notice what was saved. Not the patients, not the records, only the land. The land was then used to build the new, sterile, modern hospitals that we know today. This is the sort or scorched earth policy of the new medical elite. They had to destroy the physical evidence of a superior technology to make their inferior chemical-based system appear like a miracle. The faces of the doctors who oversaw this transition are the faces of the new authority, cold, bureaucratic, and deeply invested in the narrative of scarcity. They replace the ether with insurance. They replace the vibration with vigor. And we, the descendants of the survivors, have been trained to thank them for it. What if the insane asylums of the 1800s were not for the mentally ill, but for the unrecalibrated? What if they were holding pens for the people who still remembered how to use the old grid? The treatments described in the journals, the cold baths, the isolation, the electric shocks take on a much darker tone when viewed through this lens. They weren't trying to cure madness. They were trying to break the connection. They were trying to short-circuit the human antenna. The faces of the inmates in those early, haunting photographs are not the faces of the broken. They are the faces of the resistant. They look at the camera with a defiance that is terrifying to the new order. They knew that the walls were not there to keep them in, but to keep the frequency out. The pseudo-academic language used to justify the destruction of the old world is a masterclass in obfuscation. They call the Tartarian buildings eclectic or revivalist, terms that mean absolutely nothing in engineering but serve to dismiss the intent behind the design. They call the old medicine vitalism, a label intended to make it sound like a fairy tale. Not science, not truth, something else. But if you look at the load distribution of the domes, the math is perfect. If you look at the placement of the iron finials, the conductivity is undeniable. The gatekeepers are not stupid. They know exactly what they destroyed. They just need to make sure you never find the pieces. Ask yourself why the most advanced cyclical medical research today is quietly returning to frequency therapy and bioresonance. They are rediscovering the Tartarian wheel, but they are branding it as the future to hide the fact that it is the past. As we move deeper into this investigation, the sense of forbidden knowledge becomes a physical weight. You begin to see the circuitry everywhere. You see the erasure in the gaps between the buildings. You see the pattern in the way the history books skip over the mid-19th century with a few vague paragraphs about industrialization. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a de-industrialization? What if it was the process of replacing a clean, infinite energy source with a dirty, finite one? The faces of the factory workers in the 1880s are the first faces of the New World, soot-stained, exhausted, and disconnected. They are the first generation to be fully integrated into the machine. The unresolved philosophical loop of this part of the journey is simple. If we were once a species that could heal itself through the very air we breathed and the buildings we inhabited, what have we become? Are we still human in the way the Tartarians were? Or have we been structurally altered? The strange stories told by the faces in the archives suggest that we are living in a ghost of a civilization. We are using the basements of a palace and calling it a skyscraper. We are taking pills for a sickness that is actually a lack of light. Ask yourself, if the grid were to be turned back on tomorrow, would your body even know how to receive it? Or have we been unplugged for so long that the frequency of home would feel like a shock? The investigation deepens as we move into the structural heart of the Tartarian medical complex, focusing on the specific mechanics of the atmospheric extraction towers. Look at the blueprints of any major municipal hospital built before 1890. You will find a central vaulted chamber, often lined with white porcelain or highly polished quartz. Not a lobby, not a waiting room, something else. These chambers acted as resonant cavities for the energy collected by the exterior ironwork. The medical literature of the time, the underground pamphlets that the institutional gatekeepers misread, calls this the etheric wash. It was a process where the patient was not touched by hands, but by the very vibrations of the room. Ask yourself why these rooms were always the first to be partitioned into cramped drywall offices or destroyed during modernization efforts. What if the geometry of the circle and the dome was essential to the stabilization of the human biofield? The erasure is not just about books, it is about the physical destruction of healing spaces. The faces of the nurses in these pre-erasure wards carry an expression of absolute presence. They were not caregivers in the modern sense. They were tuning assistants. Their uniforms were not made of cotton, but of a specific heavy thread linen impregnated with silver filaments. Not a fashion choice, not a uniform. Something else. These garments acted as Faraday cages, protecting the staff from the high voltage atmospheric charge required to knit bone and seal tissue. In the photographs, you can see the way they stand, aligned with the pillars of the ward, their bodies positioned to facilitate the load distribution of the current. They understood that the healer's own frequency was a critical component of the patient's recovery. When the Flexnerian model took over, the nurse was demoted to a technician, and the silver-threaded robes were replaced by synthetic fibers that generate static interference. We were told this was for sanitation. What if it was to insulate us from each other? Consider the faces of the statues that adorn the facades of these medical cathedrals. They are often dismissed as mere allegories, Hygeia, Panacea, or nameless muses. But look at what they are holding. They carry stone pine cones, patterned rods, and vessels that look remarkably like Leyden jars. These are not symbols. They are instructional diagrams disguised as art. The pine cone represents the pineal gland, the body's primary antenna for the etheric signal. The rods represent the waveguides used to direct the flow of energy. By turning these technical tools into mythology, the gatekeepers ensured that the information remained in plain sight but was entirely unreadable to the uninitiated. This is the ultimate form of institutional gatekeeping, hiding the truth in the aesthetic. We admire the beauty of the carving, while remaining completely ignorant of the technology it depicts. Ask yourself, what if the gods of the past were simply the engineers of a reality we can no longer perceive? The pseudo-academic narrative insists that the 19th century was a time of rampant infection, yet the architectural evidence suggests a civilization obsessed with purity of field. They used light filtration systems that utilized stained glass not for religious storytelling, but for color therapy. The specific hues of the glass were calibrated to the resonant frequencies of different organs: cobalt blue for the nervous system, ruby red for the blood, emerald green for the cellular matrix. Not art, not decoration, something else. When you stand in the ruins of one of these wards, the light still feels heavy, almost liquid. It is a lingering ghost of a medical science that understood the spectrum. The faces tell a strange story because they are the faces of a population that was literally enlightened by their environment. The erasure trope has reframed this as superstition, but the physics of light frequency healing is now being rediscovered in the basement of top-tier research universities, rebranded as photobiomodulation. What if the Tartarian mud flood was used to create a global grounding? If the lower floors of these buildings were filled with silt, the connection to the deep telluric currents was muffled. This made the population more susceptible to the new artificial frequencies of the telegraph and the early power grid. The faces of the people in the 1870s show a peculiar kind of static. They appear blurred in ways that cannot be fully explained by long exposure times. It is as if their very molecular structure was in a state of flux, caught between the dying resonance of the old world and the discordant noise of the new. We are told the mud flood is a conspiracy theory, but look at the windows of your local city hall. Look at the half-buried arches. Why would a master builder put a grand entrance 3 feet below the sidewalk? They wouldn't. Not logic, not design, something else. The buildings were submerged to neutralize their medical efficacy. The technical terms used in the suppressed manuals, such as interstitial load balance, reveal an understanding of the body that modern medicine is only now beginning to grasp through the study of fascia. The Tartarians knew that the fascia was a liquid crystal matrix capable of storing and transmitting information. They didn't cure diseases. They cleared the blockages in the crystalline flow. This is why their surgical tools look so different. They were ultrasonic resonators. They used sound to dissolve tumours and restructure damaged tissue. Ask yourself why the use of sound in medicine was sidelined for a century in favour of invasive cutting and chemical poisoning. What if the faces of the ancient surgeons are calm because they knew they weren't doing any harm? They were simply retuning the instrument. Institutional erasure requires the creation of a dark age to separate the present from the inconvenient past. They tell us that before the 1900s, people lived in filth and died at 30. But if you look at the skeletal remains found in the old world cemeteries, the bone density and dental health are far superior to ours today. Not malnourished, not diseased, something else. They were the products of a medical system that prioritized structural integrity over symptom management. The faces of the elite who orchestrated the transition are documented in the oil paintings of the late 1800s. They look grim. They look burdened. They are the faces of men who know they are trading a golden age for a kingdom of iron. They are the architects of the standardized human, a biological unit that is just healthy enough to work, but too disconnected to rebel. The unresolved philosophical open loop of this investigation concerns the nature of memory. If our bodies are receivers and our environment is the signal, then what happens to our history when the signal is jammed? Are we forgetting the Tartarian medical practices because the books were burned or because our biological hardware has been downgraded? The faces in the old photographs seem to be trying to communicate a frequency we can no longer hear. They are the faces of a lost potential. Ask yourself, if you could step back into one of those star-fought hospitals, would you even recognize yourself in the mirror? Or would the sudden return of the etheric wash reveal a version of you that is more vibrant, more powerful, and more human than anything the modern world allows you to imagine? The pattern of erasure is global, but the evidence is local. It is in the old high school that used to be a clinic. It is in the waterworks that looks like a cathedral. It is in the electric substation that sits on the site of a levelled sanatorium. The gatekeepers are always moving, always renaming, always rewriting. but they cannot change the geometry of the stones. They cannot hide the way the light hits the dome at noon. The strange story is written in the load distribution of the world itself. We are living inside a giant, dormant medical device, and the only thing missing is the knowledge of how to turn it back on. What if the investigation is not about finding facts, but about remembered resonance? Look at the corner of the next historical plaque you see. Ask yourself what is being omitted. Not a date, not a name, something else. The ether is still there, waiting in the shadows of the arched windows and the copper spires. The faces of the past are watching us, waiting for the moment we stop looking at the history they gave us and start looking at the reality they left behind. The next step is to understand the faces of the reclaimed, those who have begun to rebuild the old circuits in the modern age, far from the prying eyes of the institutions. The pattern of institutional erasure reaches its zenith when we examine the mechanical apothecary of the 1880s, a period where the boundary between pharmacy and physics was intentionally blurred. In the back rooms of the great Exposition Universelle pavilions, there were devices that utilized the noble gases to create localized pockets of zero resistance, not lamps, not heaters, something else. These were plasmoid regeneration chambers. The technical drawings show patients reclining in glass tubes filled with ionized neon and argon, their faces bathed in a soft ultraviolet glow. Ask yourself why the modern medical narrative insists that the first use of light in medicine was for simple sterilization. What if they were using cold plasma to resituate the soul within the scaffolding of the bone? The erasure trope here is particularly aggressive. These devices were rebranded as neon signage or novelty lighting, their therapeutic schematics tossed into the furnace of the 1920s scientific revolution. The faces of the men who patented these devices, men like Lakovsky and Rife, all share a specific look of haunted urgency. They weren't just inventing tools, they were trying to outrun the shadow of the emerging pharmaceutical cartels. They understood that the body is a symphony of frequencies and that cancer is simply a discordant note. By using a morphic resonator, they could broadcast the correct tone and the disease would simply cease to exist. Not a battle, not a war on cells, something else. The institutional gatekeeping response was swift and brutal. Laboratories were raided, equipment was smashed. The faces of the patients who were cured were dismissed as anecdotal or psychosomatic. Ask yourself, if a technology existed that could heal with sound and light, would the people who sell you chemicals ever allow you to know its name? Observe the load distribution of the great sanatoriums once more, specifically their proximity to natural mineral springs. We are told the waters were the cure, but look at the plumbing. The pipes are not iron or lead. They are lined with silver and gold leaf. This was not for luxury, it was for ion exchange. The water was merely a carrier for a specific electrical charge harvested from the Earth's crust. The strange story told by the faces of those who emerged from these springs is one of a biological reset. They look younger. Their skin lacks the oxidative stress of the era. The erasure of this knowledge was completed by the Public Health Acts, which mandated the treatment of all natural springs, effectively deadening the water before it could reach the public. They turned a source of life into a utility, and in doing so, they severed our final link to the Tartarian vitality. What if the Civil War and the Napoleonic Wars were not about territory, but about the harvesting of biological data? The massive field hospitals of the mid-19th century were the perfect laboratories for the transition. Under the guise of emergency medicine, the new guard began the systematic mapping of the human resonant nodes. They were looking for the kill switch. The faces of the wounded in the archival photos are not just faces of pain, they are faces of bewilderment. They were subjected to experimental surgeries that involved the implantation of metallic tags and the removal of superfluous organs like the appendix and the tonsils, not for health, not for safety. Something else. They were removing the auxiliary antennas of the human body to make us more manageable, more standardized. The rhythmic staccato nature of the modern diagnostic process, test, result, dose, repeat, is a loop designed to prevent deep inquiry. The Tartarian healers used pulse diagnosis, but not the simple heart rate we measure today. They were listening for the interference patterns between the organs. They could hear the static of a coming illness months before it manifested in the physical. This is the pseudo-academic wall we hit. Modern science says this is impossible, yet the sphygmograph records from 1860 show waveforms that modern digital sensors are only now beginning to resolve. The erasure trope tells us these machines were imprecise, not imprecise, not primitive, something else. They were measuring a dimension of health that we have been blinded to. Consider the faces of the elite who reside in the walled estates of Europe and the hidden enclaves of the Americas. Look at their longevity. Look at their vitality. Do they use the same modern medicine they sell to the masses, or do they still have access to the Tartarian chambers tucked away in their private basements? The investigation suggests that the technology was never truly lost. It was simply privatized. The institutional gatekeeping is for us, not for them. They kept the star forts for themselves and gave us the concrete clinics. They kept the ether and gave us the opioid. Ask yourself, if you were an architect of this erasure, wouldn't you want to keep the God key for your own bloodline? The unresolved philosophical open loop of this fourth part is the question of compliance. Why do we accept the standardized human model? Why do we walk into the square, fluorescent lit hospitals without a second thought? Is it because we have been conditioned by the very frequencies they broadcast? The faces of the past are shouting at us through the grain of the old film, trying to tell us that the cure is not in a bottle, but in the alignment. They are trying to tell us that we are electric beings living in a chemical lie. The next time you stand before a grand old building with a copper dome, don't just look at the architecture. Feel the load. Listen for the hum. The investigation is no longer just about history. It is about the reclamation of our own biological sovereignty. The erasure of Tartarian medical science required more than just the destruction of buildings. It required the alteration of the human atmospheric interface. Look at the faces of the children in portraits from the 1840s versus those from the 1890s. There is a perceptible change in the luster of the eyes, not nutrition, not lighting, Something else. The earlier generation was born into an environment where the etheric load was still being managed by the great copper domes of the old cities. They were broad spectrum humans. By the end of the century, the introduction of the first generation alternating current, the Tesla-Edison war, being a staged distraction from the true objective, created a global static blanket. This was the first phase of the biological downgrade. Ask yourself why the most beautiful arched window sanatoriums were suddenly declared fire hazards or death traps and replaced by the modern schoolhouse architecture. The goal was to move the developing brain into a frequency dead zone. Consider the iron lung. In the official history, it is a 20th century miracle of the polio era. But if you look into the unauthorized patents of the 1870s, you find the pneumatic harmonizer. It looked similar, but it didn't just pump air. It used a series of gold-plated solenoids to create a longitudinal wave inside the chamber. Not pressure, not mechanical ventilation, something else. It was designed to repolarize the lungs after a patient had been exposed to the heavy atmosphere of the new coal-burning factories. The faces of those inside the 19th century chambers are not the faces of the dying. They are the faces of the updating. They are calm, their features softening as the machine realigns their internal load distribution with the Earth's Schumann resonance. The gatekeepers reclassified this as quackery because it offered a way to survive the industrial smog without the need for the emerging respiratory medicines that would become a multi-billion-dollar pillar of the new economy. The technical terms for this erasure are phase shifting and biodampening. The institutional gatekeepers understood that as long as the human body remained phase locked to the natural atmospheric charge, it was virtually immune to the new synthetic pathogens they were cultivating in the state labs. They had to shift our phase. They did this through the mandatory standardization of time and frequency. Before 1883, time was local, tied to the specific solar and magnetic resonance of a city. The imposition of standard time was not for the railroads. It was to synchronize the global biological clock to a synthetic pulse. Look at the faces of the people in the time-synchronized cities. They look frantic. They look hurried. They have lost the rhythm of the dome. What if the anxiety of the modern age is simply the sound of our bodies trying to find a signal that was turned off 100 years ago? What if the Red Cross was not a symbol of mercy, but a marker of claimed territory? Observe where the hospitals were built during the reconstruction periods following the Fars. They were always placed on the nodes, the specific geographic points where the old Tartarian grid was at its most potent. Not charity, not urban planning, something else. They were capping the wells. By placing a modern hospital on a high energy node, the gatekeepers could intercept the natural healing currents and filter them through their own pharmaceutical grade bureaucracy. The faces of the patients in these new wards show a distinct greyness, a lack of the inner light that the Tartarian physicians called the vitreous spark. The erasure trope tells us that this is just the reality of aging, not reality, not aging. Something else. It is the result of living in a grounded civilization where the spark is being siphoned off to power the very machines that monitor our decline. Institutional gatekeeping also utilizes semantic erasure. They took words like spirit, soul, and aura, which in the Tartarian manuals were precise mathematical terms for different layers of the biofield, and moved them into the realm of religion or New Age pseudoscience. This effectively made it impossible for a serious scientist to even discuss the mechanics of the old medicine. If you talk about aura, you are a mystic. If you talk about biophotonic emission, you are a researcher, but they are the same thing. The faces of the researchers who try to bridge this gap are the faces of the exiled. They are denied funding. They are ridiculed in the journals. They are the modern-day Tartarians, trying to rebuild a cathedral of knowledge with the tools of a mud hut civilization. Ask yourself, why is the establishment so afraid of a vocabulary of the invisible? The pattern of the investigation now brings us to the museums of anatomy. These were once the reference libraries of the Tartarian healers, filled with wax models that showed the circuits of the ether within the human frame. After the reset, these models were destroyed or hidden. The ones that remain in the basements of places like the Hunterian or the Mutta Museum are often labelled as deformities or medical curiosities. But look at the deformity. Look at the way the nervous system seems to be branching out in patterns that mimic the ironwork of the star forts. Not a mutation, not a disease, something else. These were advanced adaptations, individuals who were beginning to physically integrate the atmospheric energy of the old world. They were the new humans of 1850, and they had to be erased to make way for the standardized unit of 1900. The unresolved philosophical loop of this fifth part is the terrifying prospect of biological incompatibility. If we have been standardized and dampened for 5 generations, could we even survive in the Tartarian world? If the etheric wash were to be turned back on tomorrow, would it heal us, or would it overload our weakened circuits? The faces of the old ones look back at us with a strength that feels almost predatory to our modern sensibilities. They were a different kind of animal. They were high voltage. The investigation is no longer just about the past. It is about the hardening of our own systems. We must find the fragments of the old manuals, not to worship the past, but to upgrade the present. Ask yourself, what if the strange story is actually a set of blueprints for your own evolution? The institutional erasure of the 1900s was not merely a change in methodology, it was a fundamental rewiring of the human perception. Consider the faces of the asylum patients in the early 20th century, those who were labelled as hysteric or melancholic. If you examine the detailed sketches of their iris patterns found in the margins of discarded clinical notes, you see a phenomenon the Tartarian physicians called crystalline fragmentation. Not a psychiatric condition, not a chemical imbalance, something else. Their eyes were reacting to the sudden flicker of the new AC grid. The human eye, once a sensor for the steady longitudinal waves of the atmospheric ether, was now being bombarded by a 60 cycle per second strobe. Ask yourself why the modern world is plagued by attention deficit and neurological fatigue. What if we are all living in a state of permanent frequency shock, and the faces of the insane were simply the first to break? Under the discordance, the technical terms used to describe this period in the gatekeeper's internal memos are biostatic integration and the great dampening. They understood that to move the population into a high-density, urban, machine environment, they had to lower our internal voltage. They did this by replacing the healing domes with the public school and the factory. Look at the architecture of a 1910 high school. It is built like a prison, with heavy brick and narrow windows. It is designed to be a Faraday cage for the soul. The faces of the children are no longer radiant, they are muted. This was the institutionalization of the average. They needed a workforce that was healthy enough to operate a lathe, but too frequency dampened to notice the missing world above their heads. The erasure trope here is that this was for universal education, not education, not progress, something else. It was the domestication of the Tartarian survivor. What if the Great Depression was not a financial event, but a metabolic one? When the energy grid of the old world was finally fully decommissioned in the late 1920s, the population experienced a sudden biological crash. The faces in the breadlines are not just hungry, they are energy starved. They have lost the atmospheric supplement that kept the previous generation vibrant on half the calories. The institutional gatekeeping narrative tells us this was about market speculation and crop failure. But look at the gardens of the period. Even in the drought, the plants near the old architecture remained green. They were still receiving the residual charge of the stones. Ask yourself, why were the most beautiful public parks and city beautiful projects of the early 1900s systematically neglected or paved over in the 1930s? To remove the last grounding points where a human could still touch the ether. Consider the faces of the surgeons who were trained in the new, sterile hospitals. They are taught to view the body as a closed system, a machine that is separate from its environment. They wear masks, they wear gloves, they work in rooms that are disconnected from the Earth's electrical heartbeat. This is the aseptic fallacy. By removing the germs, they also removed the life force. The Tartarian operating theatres were always placed under grand glass domes, allowing the full spectrum of solar and atmospheric light to participate in the healing, not for visibility, not for aesthetics, something else. They understood that the light was the primary surgeon. The erasure of the glass hospital was a tactical move to ensure that healing could only happen through the permission of the medical monopoly, using their tools, their chemicals, and their artificial light. The pseudo-academic language used to dismiss the Star Fort hospitals as military fortifications is a masterpiece of misdirection. If they were forts, why do they have massive arched windows that are impossible to defend? Why are they built on hydraulic nodes? The faces of the soldiers who supposedly occupied these forts in the 1800s often look like maintenance crews. They aren't holding rifles, they are holding tuning forks and brass calipers. They were grid technicians tasked with ensuring their resonant load distribution of the city remained stable. The erasure trope tells us they were preparing for war, but look at the wars themselves. They were always directed at the star forts. The goal of the conflict was the destruction of the node. Once the node was destroyed, the population's health would collapse and they would surrender to the new chemical-based authorities without a single shot being fired. The pattern of the investigation leads us to the museum of the future, which is always a hospital. They promise us nanotechnology and genetic engineering as the ultimate cures. But ask yourself, why do we need nanobots to do what a resonant chamber used to do for free? Why do we need to edit our genes when the ether used to optimize them? The gatekeepers are selling us a digital version of a natural power they stole from us. The faces of the modern biotech entrepreneurs are the same as the faces of the 19th century robber barons. They are arbiters of scarcity. They have turned well-being into a subscription model. The unresolved philosophical loop of this part is the price of recovery. If we want to return to the Tartarian level of health, are we willing to tear down the grid that currently sustains our artificial life? The strange story is that we are the ghosts haunting our own civilization. We walk through the ruins of a high-tech medical paradise every day, but we call it the downtown. We look at the faces of the past and see primitivism because we are looking through the filter of our own downgraded biology. The investigation is a resensitization. We are learning to see the circuitry again. We are learning to hear the hum. What if the next step is not a discovery, but a remembering? Ask yourself, if you were to stop vibrating at the frequency of the machine, what would you see in the mirror? Would you recognize the Tartarian staring back at you, waiting for the power to be restored? The erasure is not absolute. There are leaks. There are anomalies in the standardized record. There are faces that refuse to be dampened. We find them in the underground clinics, in the off-grid communities, and in the private journals of the heretics. They are the keepers of the spark. They are the ones who still know how to tune a human body using nothing but a copper wire and a grand archway. The investigation is now moving toward the reclamation. We are looking for the switch. We are looking for the source. And we are starting to realize that the source was never outside of us. It was always in the vitreous flow, waiting for the static to clear. The institutional gatekeeping of the mid-20th century faced a significant problem. The physical bodies of the survivors still carried the tectonic memory of the old world. To complete the erasure, the authorities had to intervene at the level of the bone. Look at the dental records of the 1940s and 50s. This was the era of the Great Extraction, where healthy teeth were removed en masse under the guise of focal infection theory. Not surgery, not hygiene, something else. The Tartarian manuals identify the teeth as microantennas, each one tuned to a specific organ through the meridian system. By removing the antennas, the gatekeepers effectively silenced the internal communication of the human body. The faces of the post-war generation show a new kind of flattening. The jawlines are recessed. The palates are narrow. They have been detuned. Ask yourself why every modern medical advancement seems to result in a more fragile, more compressed version of the human form. What if the evolution we are told we are undergoing is actually a controlled atrophy? The technical language for this process in the suppressed monographs is anatomical standardizing. They wanted to remove any anomalous conductivity. This brings us to the mystery of the blood. In the 1800s, blood was not just a transport fluid, it was a liquid magnet. The Tartarian healers used magnetic induction to cleanse the blood without ever breaking the skin. They would place the patient within a Helmholtz coil integrated into the very architecture of the hospital walls. Not a scan, not a test, something else. The coil would create a uniform magnetic field that would realign the iron atoms in the hemoglobin, stripping away the toxins of the industrial environment through pure resonance. The erasure trope rebranded this as magnet therapy, a term now synonymous with fraud, to ensure that the real physics of magnetic blood purification would never be revisited by mainstream science. Consider the faces of the athletes and strongmen of the late 19th century. Their physical development was not the result of weightlifting as we know it, but of atmospheric saturation. They lived and trained in high charge zones. Look at the old gymnasiums of Europe, the ones with the copper-ribbed ceilings and the massive uninsulated iron pillars. These were not just for exercise, they were bioelectric accumulators. The athletes were literally plugging in to the building. The faces of these men show a density of spirit that modern bodybuilders, regardless of chemical assistance, cannot replicate. They look pallid. The institutional gatekeepers had to destroy these gyms and replace them with air-conditioned boxes to ensure that no human could ever again reach that level of natural sovereignty. They gave us cardio to keep us tired. They gave us supplements to keep us dependent. What if the space race of the 1960s was actually a search for the upper boundary of the ether? When the Tartarian grid was fully dismantled on the surface, the controllers looked to the ionosphere to see if the energy could be harvested from above. The faces of the astronauts, hidden behind polarized visors, are the faces of the new high priests of the technocracy. They are the only ones allowed to touch the source. Meanwhile, on the ground, the public health initiatives began the Global Shielding Project. This involved the introduction of lead-based paints and asbestos insulation in every home. We were told this was for protection and safety. Not protection, not safety. Something else. It was to ensure that even the residual charge of the atmosphere could no longer reach the human skin. We were being coated in a layer of dead material to complete our isolation from the world pulse. The pattern of erasure is most evident in the redesign of the city. Observe the way the modern highway systems of the 1950s were carved through the hearts of the old districts. They didn't just destroy homes, they severed the circuits. They broke the pedestrian flow that allowed the human body to move through the resonant geometry of the old streets. The faces of the suburbanites are the faces of the disconnected. They live in non-conductive wooden houses, drive in rubber-tired cars, and work in steel-framed towers. They are electrical orphans. Ask yourself why you feel so alive when you walk through an ancient stone-paved city square and so drained when you walk through a modern shopping mall. It isn't nostalgia, it is resonance. You are feeling the difference between a live wire and a dead one. The pseudo-academic institutional gatekeeping also created the history of psychology to explain away the ghost signals of our lost heritage. They told us that the voices we heard, the faint, humming vibrations of the earth, were auditory hallucinations. They told us that the vision of the grid was schizophrenia. They turned our supersensory abilities into diagnoses. The faces of the heavily medicated are the faces of the silenced. They are the ones who were too sensitive to the static. By drugging the receivers, the gatekeepers ensured that the signal would never be interpreted. What if the mentally ill are simply the people who can still see the Tartarian architecture for what it really is? A giant dormant healing machine that is screaming to be turned back on. The unresolved philosophical open loop of this seventh part is the nature of the cage. If the cage is made of frequencies and materials, then the key must be physical as well. We cannot think our way out of a bioelectric prison. We have to rebuild. The faces of the modern biohackers and homesteaders are the first signs of the resistance. They are stripping the lead from their walls. They are grounding their beds. They are seeking out the mineral springs. They are trying to reconnect the vitreous flow. But ask yourself, is it enough to save yourself, or must we save the city? The strange story is that the source is still there, beneath the asphalt and the drywall. It is patient, it is infinite, and it is waiting.